You are listening to the Political Periscope, a weekly podcast brought to you by Radio WNET. Interviews on international politics, security, geopolitics, economy, and more. Every Thursday at 7 p.m.
In today's episode of the Political Periscope, you will listen to two interviews. The first one with Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch, author of the book The China Nexus. The second with Jack Herndon, program manager at the International Republican Institute, expert on China's influence in the world.
Political Periscope.
Benedict Rogers. Last weekend, we've observed the Munich Security Forum, and there was one speech in this forum that really drew my attention. It was Wang Yi's speech, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. It was really, outstanding in a way of other speeches, because I think that it was different. There was a lot of content actually in this speech. We knew already what others were going to say, more or less. It wasn't a big surprise, but Wang Yi, for me, personally, was a surprise. Maybe for you, as an expert, it wasn't.
Yes, I think it was definitely, perhaps not a surprise, but certainly very significant. And I think it is a sign of the regime in China really accelerating and intensifying its hostility towards the West, towards the free world. And of course, it was followed by his visit to Moscow, where he described the relationship between China and Russia as rock solid. And to me, at a time when we're in the we're about to mark the first anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, for Wang Yi to express such support for Putin and for Russia is also very significant. So I think it's a sign of the increased tensions, but also an attempt to try to divide the West, because I know Wang Yi is also trying to exert influence within Europe. So I think very significant.
Exactly. You said dividing the world, the West. He mentioned a few times that Europe has to make its choice. So he's putting Europe on the opposite of the US, which has already made its choice. Do I understand it well?
I think that's correct. I think he's clearly trying to turn Europe against the US. And I think already, for some time now, China has been exerting influence, at least in parts of Europe, through commercial ties, and then as a result of commercial ties, trying to turn Europe politically and in terms of security matters as well. So yes, I think that is their aim.
In a way, the Chinese project to influence, to raise its influence in Europe, especially Central Europe, is failing. Because we see such countries as Lithuania, Estonia, but also even Poland diminishing its level of cooperation with China. But there are also other regions of the world. Do you think China really still has a possibility to influence Europe economically, to gain maybe some political influence also here?
I think you're correct that attitudes are changing and becoming more critical of China in much of Europe. And you're right to point especially to Lithuania and Estonia. And I think in other parts of the European Union, to varying degrees, opinion is starting to shift. But there are still clear links between China and parts of Europe. I think the influence in Hungary, for example, is still worryingly strong. And but as you say, there are other parts of the world where China is exerting perhaps even more influence, particularly in its own backyard in the Asia region, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, where it's definitely making a big impact, and to some extent in Latin America. and the Middle East. Xi Jinping, I think, was in Saudi Arabia fairly recently. So they are trying to expand their influence as a global power.
In the 90s and in the beginning of the 21st century, Russia seemed to be for the West a counterweight for China. However, right now it's rather China stopping Russia in its war against West. But also for China, Russia is a competitor in Central Asia. What are real relations between Russia and China?
Well, I'm not an expert on China-Russia relations, but my observation is that they've actually strengthened their relationship quite considerably, at least on the surface, because they see it as to their advantage, to the advantage of both Beijing and Moscow, to present the narrative as a struggle between authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes. And so if that's the way the narrative is framed, clearly Beijing and Moscow are allies in pursuit of their authoritarian vision for the world. And it's quite concerning. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, just ahead of the Munich conference, expressed concern that China might provide arms to Russia. Clearly, as I mentioned, Wang Yi's visit to Moscow just before the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine and describing the relationship as rock solid is a sign that if China is on anybody's side in the matter of Ukraine, it clearly is on Putin's side. So having said that, I think it is a sort of marriage of convenience. And I think clearly there are some areas like Central Asia where they're in more competition and other areas where they're more in alliance.
China is also seen as a possible market for Russian oil and gas, but is it a plausible solution for Russia?
I think it's certainly it would provide something of a further lifeline to Russia if that happens. And I mean, it's been very noticeable since the start of the war in Ukraine, since the invasion, that China has really clamped down on any expressions domestically of opposition to the invasion. And I think that China as a market for Russian gas would be another way of Putin prolonging and sustaining his regime and his war. So yes, I think it would be significant.
Do you think that China wants to sustain Putin's war, to prolong it? It's not really good for their interests in Europe. It makes it difficult for them to transport goods from China to Europe via trains, and it seems to be their preferred mode of transport. So why isn't China intervening in some way politically, putting a pressure to end this war?
Yes, I think the regime in China has actually conflicting interests, because on the one hand, it is a regime that seems to really value stability, and that seems to always be their priority, is stability, and therefore one would think from that point of view that they would want the war to end and for there to be peace in Ukraine. On the other hand, I guess that ideologically what they don't want is a victory for the West, or a victory for the free world, and a victory for democracy, which is what a Ukrainian victory over Putin would be and would symbolize. So my guess is they would probably be playing a number of different sides and maybe exerting influence where they can with Putin to try to reach some kind of compromise and try to end the war. But they don't appear to be doing anything at all to oppose Putin or anything at all to support Ukraine. And so I think that's because of these conflicting interests of wanting stability, but on the other hand, not wanting democracy, freedom, and the West to defeat their ally.
You said it's some kind of alliance between authoritarian regimes. I remember well, there was a period, maybe 12, 15 years ago, when it seemed that China could go towards democracy. Right now, are there such tendencies right now in China, or it went completely the opposite way?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely correct. I have been working on China for more than 30 years. I first went to China in 1992 when I was 18 years old to teach English for 6 months. And I've traveled to China many times since then, although in 2017 I was denied entry to Hong Kong on the orders of Beijing. And so I haven't been able to go back since then. But my observation, and I described this actually in a new book that I just published called The China Nexus. My observation was that in the late 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s, China was definitely opening up. Whether it was headed for democracy as such, I think is in doubt, but certainly it was a period of relative relaxation. There was some form of civil society, albeit restricted, and there were red lines. But within those red lines, there was some space for civil society, some space even for dissent, for independent media and bloggers, even Chinese lawyers who were able to take up human rights cases. So that was happening during those years. I think what happened, definitely the situation has gone in a totally opposite direction in the last 10 or 12 years, particularly under the leadership of Xi Jinping. I think the crackdowns predated Xi Jinping in that it probably began around the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And I think at that point, the regime in Beijing felt, firstly, they had secured the accolade of hosting the Olympics. So they'd sort of got everything they wanted and didn't feel the need to please the West. But also at the same time, there was a movement within China known as the Charter 08 movement, which was led by the former the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo. And that was a movement very much for democracy. And Liu Xiaobo ended up being arrested and, of course, died in detention. And at around that same time, there were the various color revolutions, the so-called Arab Spring and other uprisings around the world. And I think the regime in China looked around the world and saw these movements for democracy and movements that were overthrowing dictatorships. And became very alarmed and perhaps thought that they had allowed liberalization, relaxation, the space that had emerged to go too far, and they felt threatened by that. And so they imposed this crackdown. And today, all of that space that I described has disappeared. Many of the people who were operating within that space, lawyers and dissidents and activists, have also disappeared. And there has been a serious crackdown on all basic freedoms and human rights. And on top of that, of course, there has been the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, continued atrocities in Tibet, intensifying religious persecution of Christians and of others, and the genocide of the Uyghur people, and which is increasingly being recognized as a genocide. So there was that window of opportunity where I myself was hopeful for China's future. But as I describe in my new book, it's gone in a really terrible direction in the last decade.
The pandemic of COVID-19 showed that China can be really vulnerable when it came to to cut chains of supply to ships withheld in ports. It was a really bad situation for China. Also, there are some demographic struggles right now. In few decades, China's social system can collapse.
Yes, that's exactly correct. I think the one-child policy that China had for many years, which they've now changed to, I believe, a two-child policy, but for many years it was forbidden to have more than one child. And that really did huge damage to the demographics. It meant a totally disproportionate number of men who weren't able to find women to marry. That led to a rise in trafficking of women from other countries in Asia to be sold effectively as wives for Chinese men, and a lot of other big problems. And I think the pandemic has caused a number of problems for China. Firstly, of course, in terms of its international reputation, the fact that it failed to alert the international community to COVID-19 early enough, and the fact that it basically covered up the truth about COVID for quite a long time, silenced the doctors who were trying to raise the alarm about it. But also it did obviously huge economic damage, as it did to all countries. And then I think politically, it was really interesting to see at the end of last year, the protests that emerged across China, quite large protests. I would say they were the largest and most significant protests that we have seen since the Tiananmen protests of 1989. And what was significant about them was that although they were protests sparked by the very draconian lockdown policies that the regime had put in place because of COVID, the zero COVID policy, actually, when you listen to what the protesters were saying, they were not just saying lift the lockdown, end the zero COVID policy. They were actually saying Xi Jinping stepped down and Chinese Communist Party stepped down. And that's the first time I've heard protests making such a political attack on the regime so overtly in a long time. So I think, and of course, the response from the regime was very unusual in that they actually did respond to the protesters' demands and lifted the COVID restrictions very suddenly and dramatically. And it's very unusual for the regime to give in to popular pressure. So that to me suggested that this regime is perhaps more fragile and weak than we might have previously thought. And that brings a lot of questions and challenges for the next few years for China.
So is there any threat for world peace, any threat for the West from China?
Yes, I think there is a growing and very serious threat. First of all, I think for the first time in decades, the likelihood of a Chinese attempt to invade and take Taiwan has increased very significantly. If you'd asked me 5 or 10 years ago whether I thought a military invasion of Taiwan was likely, I would have been quite skeptical. Now I wouldn't put a time frame on it. I think it's unpredictable, the timing. But I think the intention and the likelihood has certainly increased, and it's something we should try to prevent, and we should certainly be alert to. But also, I think China is a threat to us in Europe and in the free world. Not so much militarily necessarily, but through espionage, influence, intimidation, infiltration campaigns. The influence within universities, within the business sector, within various other sectors is now, I think, very significant. In the UK, there are something like at least 40 or more than 40 British universities that have direct research agreements with institutions in China that are linked directly to the regime and to the military, giving them access to research and knowledge that could potentially be used against us. So yes, I think not the Chinese people, but the Chinese Communist Party regime is certainly a threat to the free world. In fact, arguably, although Putin's invasion of Ukraine is the most serious imminent military threat, I think in the long term, actually China is the bigger threat and the biggest threat to freedom in the world.
Do you think that if China tries to annex Taiwan, tries to invade Taiwan, could it start the Third World War?
It certainly has that potential. Of course, I hope that Western countries, particularly the United States, would come to Taiwan's aid in such a situation, and that obviously could therefore mean a confrontation between the US and China. I think other regional allies, such as Japan, would probably be involved. And if the West doesn't act doesn't act militarily, that also is very dangerous because China then would be emboldened if they're able to take Taiwan. They probably won't stop there. They'll threaten other countries in the region. So either way, I think it would be an extremely dangerous situation and has the makings of a third world war, or at least probably the biggest war that we have faced in my generation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jack Herndon. A few days ago, there was a security conference in Munich. And among many speakers, there was also Wang Yi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. And his speech seemed rather hostile towards the United States. He expresses verbis accused the United States of stealing the benefits from China. What is the current attitude of China towards the United States? Was this speech reflecting it well?
I mean, the speech definitely reflects the current attitude of the Chinese government towards the United States. Obviously, it's probably the worst it's been in decades. There was an opportunity, and it doesn't look like there's many opportunities moving forward for it to improve, at least in 2023. Blinken and Wang Yi did look like they managed to meet on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference. However, the readouts of the meetings kind of suggest that they're both talking past each other. I think Wang's speech at the Munich Security Conference definitely reflected the PRC's current agenda, which is to discredit the United States, appeal to the European sense of strategic autonomy, appeal to kind of fears of the direction that the war in Ukraine is going, and try to frame everything as though this is caused by the United States, that the United States is just dragging Europe into another Cold War, that it is pouring fuel on the flames of the war in Ukraine, and that the United States is solely responsible for its continuation. But really, hostility of the Chinese government towards the United States is nothing new. It's actually fairly consistent. We're just seeing it a little bit more up front now. According to the Chinese government, or actually the Chinese Communist Party, the United States is its primary contradiction, to use its own communist terms. This is how it's actually seen the United States from the 1950s, from the beginning of the Cold War, through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, even though the rhetoric was very different at that point. We're just simply seeing it kind of resurge as the party becomes more self-confident and assertive. I don't think that this is any deviation from where things normally stand. However, it does look like there's decreased communication between these two governments, and the bottom seems to be falling out under the relationship.
While Joe Biden visited Kiev and Warsaw, Wang Yi went to Moscow. Yeah. So can we consider China a Russian ally right now?
Well, they are technically speaking. China only has one ally, and it's the North Koreans. They traditionally don't take allies. However, it's very clear that Russian and Chinese interests are increasingly aligned. They are two revisionist powers that want to blunt the power and influence of the United States and to reshape the global order in a way that defangs it of its democratic values, so that they can have regime security for their own model of governance. Wang Yi's visit to Russia might be laying the groundwork for Xi's visit later this spring. It definitely shows that over the course of the last year, Beijing and Moscow have only grown closer together, not further apart during this war. And Biden's visit to Kyiv kind of really underlines the direction that the United States is going, that it's committed to defending democratic values. There is no formal security treaty between the United States and Ukraine. The only reason why the United States provides security support to Ukraine is very much for the defense of democratic values, and that's really what holds that relationship together.
Joe Biden here in Warsaw said that it's actually a war against authoritarian regimes, fight against authoritarian regimes, of democracy against authoritarian regimes. Do you think he included also China?
100%. I mean, China is at the top of the United States list of priorities. China is really the primary long-term threat. Russia is still very problematic. However, China is the only country with both the power, economic power, diplomatic power, security power to change the world order, and it has the intent to do so. Russia is really not the same level of threat to the United States. So very much, I think China is actually at the top of that list. Something that the United States definitely fears is a closer Russia and China, because that actually makes it incredibly difficult if it ever comes to blows between China and the United States. But I think that there's no doubt about it that part of what Biden is talking about is China as an authoritarian power being part of a long-term struggle against the United States and its allies for the structure and fate and nature of the future of the world order. So yeah, I think that absolutely China is included in there. Although during his speech, I think that it was interesting that Biden actually didn't mention China. The visit was actually very, very focused on Ukraine and Russia and making sure to maintain the morale in Europe to continue to support Ukraine as sanctions fatigue really sets in, as capitals get a little bit jittery and want to look for different kinds of off-ramps in order to alleviate their own economic issues. So China's definitely involved in this struggle. However, yes, it wasn't mentioned during the speech, but it's definitely top of mind.
There is this threat that if Russia collapses, if the Russian state is no more, there will be a vacuum of power in Central Asia, in Siberia. What could China do in such circumstances?
China doesn't actually have the power to completely support the state of Russia from collapse. Which is why we're going to see support from China to Russia in order to prevent it ever reaching that point. China is not capable of providing security in the region. Traditionally there's been a real division of power in Central Asia, with Russia as the main security actor and China as the main economic actor. If the Russian state were to collapse, there'd be, yes, like you said, the big vacuum of power, but also huge potential for instability. China would have to increase its capacity to project power into the region and provide a more security role. However, it's really at this point in time ill-equipped to do so, especially as its attention is turned towards its coast to a potential conflict with the United States over Taiwan. There's a lot of speculation that China is interested in gaining control over Russian lands in order to have access to resources. That's really speculation. It's also, I don't think, that within China's interest. China has plenty of problems of its own. Domestically, it doesn't actually, I don't think that it has any territorial ambitions on the Eurasian continent of at least Russian lands. So it's definitely within its interests for Russia to maintain coherence and to support the Russian state as long as it can.
Earlier you mentioned that for the United States is the China, indeed, which is the biggest threat, not Russia. Now, for many years, Russia was even seemed as counterweight for China in the region. But do you think this argument of China can be used by some political groups, maybe some Republicans, especially Trumpists, to advocate for not helping Ukraine or for engaging less?
Yeah, so there's definitely the war in Ukraine definitely diverts the attention of the United States and its allies. It diverts resources as well. I mean, it's drawing from stockpiles. Arguably, this could detract from the amounts of support that the United States would otherwise give to the Indo-Pacific region. Currently, I don't think that we've actually seen any material effect like that. I think that it's still been able to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's still been able to maintain engagement in East Asia. If anything, I think the war in Ukraine has really underlined U.S. credibility of its dedication to defending democracy, because that's also what the United States' primary interests are in Taiwan. It is one of the strongest democracies in Asia. So I think that it's been a boon for credibility. Yes, it's been a draw on U.S. attention and resources and that of its allies as well. However, at this point in time, I don't think that it's reduced the readiness of the United States to respond. I mean, there's to a Taiwan Straits crisis. There are its own set of issues in that region, even without the Ukraine factor being involved. I think that at this point in time, the two are somewhat separate and not affecting each other.
Wolfgang Ischinger, who was speaking with Wang Yi, asked him to assure the audience that there is no imminent military escalation in Strait of Taiwan. In response, Wang Yi said that he can assure audience that Taiwan is part of China and that all the fault for the conflict is on the side of, as he said, Taiwan separatists. So do you think there is an imminent threat of military escalation?
China has never ruled out the use of force to quote unquote reunify with Taiwan. Escalation is always possible. I think it's actually increasingly possible as China actually faces a closing window of opportunity. On Taiwan Island, you have a kind of a natural indigenous identity of Taiwan as an independent country really taking root among youth in Taiwan, and as that goes on, as that kind of independent identity grows stronger, it becomes increasingly difficult for the PRC to take and hold Taiwan Island. So there's that kind of time pressure there to move sooner rather than later. There's a few other factors that also make escalation increasingly likely, as Taiwan's defense posture has mostly been shaped towards head-to-head conflict with the PRC, at least traditionally. So for the past for at least 5 decades following the Civil War. Or 4 decades following the Civil War, most of Taiwan's defense was actually geared towards invading and retaking the mainland. I mean, that was like kind of one of Chiang Kai-shek's legacies there. So actually, now actually Taiwan is very much ill prepared for any potential conflict with the PRC. It's been changing those structures to become more of what it calls a porcupine, or something that's very difficult to hold. It's been developing more of its asymmetric capabilities, which are designed to try to slow down any potential invasion by the PRC. Instead of meeting it head on, and it becomes crucial for it to slow down the PRC or the PLA long enough for there to be a response by the United States and its allies. So that's a factor. It's like as it develops that capacity, that's also more adding pressure to this closing window of opportunity for the PLA. And secondly, the United States and its allies are putting more resources in the region. I don't know if you saw recently, there's an agreement between the United States and the Philippines to give them access to 4 bases in the Philippines. One in particular is at the very north end of the Philippines, which will greatly improve the ability of the United States to respond to any potential crisis there. So that as Taiwan slows down the PLA's advance and the United States increases its ability to respond rapidly, again, we're in a situation where China's ability to take Taiwan decreases over time. So these and then it actually even gets worse than that. Both sides actually have first mover advantage in this situation. If China were to strike first, it would gain advantage by striking Guam and other U.S. air bases in the Indo-Pacific. If the United States were to strike first, it would target the PLA's communications and targeting bases. And blind the PLA so that it'd be able to respond. So not only is there a closing window of opportunity, both sides of this conflict have huge incentives to strike first. So it's actually an incredibly dangerous situation and very rocky and hard to see how it moves forward. Escalation is definitely also a political priority of Xi Jinping. Something that he has said before is something that he wants to address during his time in power, which now looks like it's going to be until the rest of his life. But still, it is something that has in each national party congress has been a priority and something that the party mentions that it's something that it wants to accomplish soon.
So, do you think we are approaching the Third World War?
I mean, that's a big question. I think that if we're not already, we're definitely already in a Cold War. It's really hard to say at what point it is or is going to happen, or would or is going to happen. I'm not a defense expert, so I'm a little bit. I'm not the person to ask these questions in particular. I look more at the political side of things, but. It's definitely a tangible possibility.
Last question. China seemed to draw the line for Russia at the use of chemical and nuclear weapons. However, we know from the past that Russia can use whatever weapon Russia chooses to use. Yeah. So what could be China's response?
China's policies have been consistent. It has always been against first use of nuclear weapons. So for it to say that is cheap and easy. I don't think that that's any significant difference than what it said before. So I don't think that actually makes any difference to Putin on his choice whether or not to use nuclear weapons. On the biochemical weapons, I think actually, if anything, China has made it easier or has given further justifications to Russia to use these weapons if it so chooses. I think that it's important to remember that one of the justifications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the claim that there was U.S. biochemical weapons bases or biochemical laboratories there. This is something that the Chinese government really caught on to because it also supports its own disinformation internally, saying that the COVID-19 actually was manufactured by U.S. bioweapons labs and then brought to China in October of 2019. So it's actually strengthened Russia's justification for using biochemical weapons if it chooses. So I don't think that while it might say that it opposes the use of biochemical weapons, it definitely hasn't done anything to deter their use, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
This was the Political Periscope. The podcast is released every Thursday at 7 p.m.